All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and good afternoon, morning, depending on where you are. This is Matt Maxwell. I appreciate you taking some time to join us here as we discuss part 4 of our Millennial series. We've covered some really good information regarding millennials, who they are, where they are, and a lot of different points for them. We're going to get started in just a little bit. I know we've got a couple of people who are going to be running a minute or two late and having to log in, so we'll give them some times here. But before we go too far, I do want to make sure that as you see some of the content and we have the great discussion today, you can always go through in the comments and be able to post a question as well. And either myself or one of our team here can hop on and either answer questions, or they can tee them up and hand me a note here so I can hopefully address them. This has been one of the most highly sought after and energetic webinars we've had series. We have about 100 or so financial institutions really signed up for a series of webinars we've got spread out this week with the same topic. So we're really excited. And more importantly, I'm glad that you are, because that's a big component as we go into talking about millennials. So to set expectations appropriately, why don't we talk about today's format? So I'm going to go through and go through a couple different components. Let's click next here. But before we do that, I want to talk about this series we've had thus far and why this one's so critical in today's discussion. So part 1 was really about recruiting millennials, who they are, where they are, what they look like, what applications they're using, all those type components, specifically targeting for them for staff. You could always apply this for marketing campaigns, of course, but just specifically targeting our staff for the organization and our banks. Now, with that being said, there's a lot of benefits to knowing, this specific and unique generation. And then the next part was really setting expectations. So it's the different questions, how hiring has changed, the onboarding process. What's that look like for a digital native, and why is that important for our bank? And then the third part, which was really fun, was the growth and retention. How do we get them so engaged that they're able to go through and be able to share content and be able to do that from there. So again, feel free to punch in questions into the chat box. We posted a note there so you can see it within GoToWebinar. But otherwise, we're going to get started here and continue today's discussion. Again, along the lines of expectations, today's discussion will probably take about 25, maybe 30 minutes, depending on questions and things of that nature. But it's really meant to be a quick intensive of tools for you to be able to apply within your organization. That is the main goal for us. And as part of that, to give a little bit of background about myself, I'm the Director of Business Development. My name is Matt. I've been working with Passageways, celebrating my 6th year here at Passageways here at the end of the month, and excited to have worked with millennials my whole life. I fought it for the longest time. Those of you that have been with me throughout the 3-part series can know I talked about the conflict I had internally dealing with. I am a millennial, technically. I fall in that demographic. So I've got a photo of me and my son from this past weekend. He made the All-Stars, and I've been helping coach as well in that process. So it's very, very personal to us, right? It's a very different demographic, and rather than a suit and tie photo from my LinkedIn, this is part of it, right? As a millennial, I naturally think a little bit different than a baby boomer and, of course, a Generation X. Okay. So let's talk about the difference between these. Again, some of this will be recap, but I want to remind you, because I've slept at least once or twice since the last series of webinars, but want to set the stage as to who millennials are, where they are in the mix, and why this is important. And then we'll jump right into the new content. So the first and biggest part here is millennials are known as tech savvy. Their perception of we're not tech savvy because it's the way we've grown up, and often known as not being great team players. Okay, and I won't read through all these, but you can get a sense for Generation X being the entrepreneurs and baby boomers, of course, being loyal. And the biggest way we can see this is Generation X is obviously known for starting many businesses, and even the .com era, the mid 90s and late 90s even, if you think about all the different things and initiatives that have been taken on. And then, of course, baby boomers. I remember distinctly a story of being told how one baby boomer was proud to work at Ford for 20 years. That was the place to work and where you wanted to go. And I almost guarantee that's not on most people's top 10 job picks fresh out of college nowadays. Okay, so that's part of the change we're seeing within the group. Okay. Now, why is this important? So as you can see, the green line here going up, you can see our millennials now up over 53% of our workforce. So many of you within your organizations have seen this, where over half our staff, our frontline staff specifically, within our banks and other organizations, we've seen this shift, right, in our baby boomers. But the quickest to get there, one of the biggest generations here throughout the process. And what we're historically known for is our age. So roughly, depending on which survey you look at or report, roughly it's the 1980, born in 1980 through 96, roughly, those 16 years-ish, plus or minus, depending on the reports you're looking at. So for the roughly, today's discussion, we're talking about our 18 to 35s, right in that mix. And some traits, married late. I fall in that demographic technically. I got married at 26. And really excited to be able to share that we have a big chunk of the buying power and some other cool ins and outs here. So by each report. So I want to break down some specific statistics and numbers for you to be able to take. And the big one being that from the Millennial webinar series we've done various polls. If you've been a part of that, thank you very much. You've helped us create some wonderful resources for our ICBA partner and other banks that have been exploring, how to get the most out of this generation. Over 60% of staff is what we're finding, between 50 and 60 there, are millennials. And 83% of the managers, or 83% of organizations fall into 0 to 10% are millennials. So a good chunk of the millennial generation haven't hit middle management or management, even leadership positions, right? That's still a ways off. But I want to track that as we continue these conversations. And I talk about the next series we have coming on with the success of this one. And really, I wanted to track the universal tellers. Most organizations are still between 0 and 20%. Many of our banks are still in the 0 to 10 range for universal tellers. But I can tell you the trend is significantly trending positive and an increase as to that's the expectation moving forward. All right, so for today's discussion, and let's frame this up a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about how to get the most out of the ADD generation, the shiny objects, the squirrels, the digital natives, whatever term or reference you want to plug in there, feel free to do so. But it's how do we get the most out of them and increase to make it a place where ultimately it's great for everybody, beneficial for everybody, not just short-term but long-term goals as well. So I promise you again, we're going to have this conversation hopefully wrapped up here in another 15 to 20 minutes. So let's get to it. One of the biggest things you can focus on is the community. So millennials take great pride in giving back. They'd much rather go to a third world nation and work for little to nothing than they would work for a Fortune 100 company. Very different approach. So within our organizations, you have to be able to plug in that dire need for working with the community. long-term. And why this is important now for long-term and sustained growth is millennials can reach millennials. And if they've already got the buying power, you want your staff already out there with their unique personalities in presenting this. I can't tell you how many banks have come to Passageways recently and talked about how we have to engage staff. We need to be able to do more. We need to be able to engage them so we can ultimately not lose them every 2 to 3 years. Okay, this is a very high turnover. If you missed that session, that's in one of our previous webinars. But this is key. So we want to be able to have this generation specifically tied into the community, and some of these can be through nonprofits, charitable organizations. But as we sponsor these as an organization, as a bank, as a financial institution, we can ultimately give back while increasing the output of our staff. And this is really key as we begin to think about long-term growth, because you want to be known as an organization that adapts and goes from there. Next part is building the internal community. You have to build it from there. It's the same type concept. Many of our banks are still using shared drives and email, and if they have an intranet, it's not engaging, it's not fun, it's not something where we can share and talk about community events and find everything I need in milliseconds. It's a very different. We talked about that in the last webinar in detail. That's what we find here at Passageways, especially is groups who don't have a centralized place to find anything. And if they do, it's updated by one person sometimes from those pieces. So I want to encourage you to think about internal community, whether you do it electronically with an employee intranet, such as the one I was describing, or you have teams, cross-functional teams, raising money for local charities and giving back, sponsoring outreaches. I can tell you how many banks will post in here community event sign-up opportunities. If you've only got certain room for, carpooling or things of that nature, to know how many people are going to help with the Habitat for Humanity event this weekend, a great opportunity to do it in the solution or just a process like this today. And this is key, especially. So we're building community outside, we're building community inside. Now, how does this tie back to succession planning? So that's a big part of today's discussion. And ultimately, as we have a new culture, right, and we can support it as leadership, but it has to become somebody's ownership internally, right? You have to have those cheerleaders, as it were, somebody to get up and go and be passionate and do it. And that's what this generation is known for. Now you have them bought in. And the benefit to this, too, is as we keep, right, we retain our best employees, the goal is we want more like them. And like-minded people tend to attract others, right, and positive creatures. This is just a great way to be able to make sure that we're all on the same page and being able to find what we need when we need it. So let's talk about from a general sharing of information. So the biggest component in change when it comes to leadership styles and things of that nature, millennials, as we're starting to see them take over leadership roles, rely more on metrics than they actually do the feel-good components. They need basic metrics that they're able to benchmark themselves against to be able to either knock out of the park individually, right, because we talked about the less of a team. It's more of a community. That's different than the team. But you want to be able to have a community feel from that. Well, part of that is sharing our goals and information. We highly encourage that you go through and have centralized places for metrics. What's going on? Where are we going? What projects are important right now? What initiatives are going on within the organization? Not that we've ever gotten that question from staff as to what's going on when. I'm sure you can be nodding your head to that. We all can, right? We can do a much better job as leadership to be able to make sure that our staff are in the know. And just a centralized place for goals and information. We do that through organization-wide by being able to have dashboards and information, and end users be able to manage some of that content. But even as you start to work with that next generation of leaders, you have to understand that they want to be metrics-driven. I can tell you that Bob Folk with Purdue Federal, what they do is in every one-on-one or leadership meeting, he pulls up the dashboard within their portal and solely talks about those points. He's not pulling up a performance review. He's not pulling up a document that's on the shared drive that 5 people have access to and gets updated once a week, 10 minutes before the meeting. Not that we've ever done that, of course. It's a very different way of working with staff and ultimately being able to go through and make sure that staff are engaged and knowing what's going on, right? You need to be disclose some of those components as much as possible. And the next component is the change in performance reviews. We talked about this last group, but as the digital natives take over, one of the glaring components is we're noticing that waiting a year for performance review is really not doable at all. Okay, it's something where they need instant gratification. They can't wait 12 months for gratification and to know where they are, because if you only get 2 years with them in their current stage, because most millennials again are 2 to 3 years, you may only get 2 reviews with them. That's not enough time for coaching opportunities. That's not enough time for guiding the ship in a different direction, right? You want to be able to work live with them to be able to answer questions, guide them down the path, and be able to do it. And this is huge because most groups, again, talking about the use of spreadsheets, that is the bigger component as opposed to having those quote unquote meetings regarding this. So some big components, whether you do it within a portal, whether you do it with your staff, it's a very, very, very different component when it comes to working with them. Now this is a big one. So some of the components we talked about today have been very, very, very basic. This is one that is kind of out in front, but a lot of people don't know how to help. A lot of baby boomers and Generation Xers do not have the insight as to how to help. Because this comes more naturally. We were told how to do it, and that's your job, and you do it that way. I have leaders and mentors that I follow, and that's some of their leadership styles. Versus the millennials, and I can attest to this as well, very conflict adverse. Rather than fighting about something and arguing, avoiding conflict is really the root of that. It's really, really, really tough, and especially when they feel like they're friends with groups, it really could become awkward or uncomfortable giving peers that feedback. And young millennial managers, a lot of them could fear this, but or fear they won't be taken seriously, right? It's a very different component, and worried about how does this impact the friendship. And those are really the core behind constructive feedback. I can tell you it's coachable. You can work them through it. You have to identify it first, right? It's not natural. It's not something we just do from there, okay? And this is something that's very crucial as we go through and are working with millennials to be able to go through and ultimately get them to be successful long term, because again, this is a group that's going to be taking over one day. Not all that far off in the future, and setting those basic business practices up today and expectations is vital. And it falls in line with the rest of the series where we talked about onboarding and setting expectations appropriately. All right, so the next component is really near and dear to my heart, and this is the mentor philosophy. This has been around for age after age after age. There's books after, you are who's around you. And I wanted to plug in my specific mentor ring here, my net as it were, in various, leaders and mentors and people I go to whenever I have a question and advice. This is something you have to have an infrastructure in place and encourage for staff. Okay, whether they have it internally or not, they're looking for it. They want a coach and a mentor. They don't want a manager who says, go do this, right? It's a very different relationship. And when you go and use, some of these best practices, it's very different. And if you don't have this infrastructure internally, you have to encourage them to look externally. This is something very distinctly that I can remember 2 periods in my life. Just to stick with the millennial thread, think of it like going through your Facebook or LinkedIn friends and disconnecting from others, changing who's around you, molding where you want to go and what you want to be. That is crucial to your success. And ultimately, as leaders, we have to set that expectation and encourage them as well. Encourage our leaders, right? Leaders, not just bosses. We need to encourage our leaders within the organization to be able to share the information, share their experiences, what they've learned, the ways, the problems they've hit, rather than just telling. And I know that's very difficult for some of our banks and other groups, and those of you that aren't a bank or a financial institution. But it's very key to prolonged success. Okay, you want to have something that's worth more tomorrow than it is today. And there's some key values that you can take. For instance, in each one of these individuals from my personal web here, mentor web, is each one of them have specific abilities that I glean from and pull best practices out of each one, rather than saying, yes, I have one. Well, one gives you a small sample size. We've all been there, right? Everybody reads the one book and they read that as, that's the law and that's the only way we can do it, when in reality, we're all individual creatures. We're all individual people. And as staff, when we tap into who are they and what do they like, what are their passions, to plug into the community aspect and get that within our organization, now you have a movement. And that is what you want within your organization. I can tell you, we've seen it time and time again within the banks that we work with. It's really cool to see when groups get in and they're firing on all cylinders. And ultimately, I get quotes or texts or emails or calls from groups who influence saying, I don't know what we would have done before. I can't imagine having business without, tools and resources and expectations of collaboration, right? Setting up the community. It's very, very, very key, especially to this generation. So as promised, in closing, give you some really good advice here on other components. So setting expectations, prolonged. Why is this important to succession planning? Because to be honest, with millennials and talking about long-term and prolonged, these are the trends we're seeing. And I can tell you, having worked with millennials and being one my whole life here, obviously, but having hired hundreds in previous roles, I can tell you this is pretty consistent. If you can set an organizational culture, what you want it to be, and progress it and continue to move forward, empowering staff, changing the way we report, having one-on-one meetings rather than, say biweekly or monthly as opposed to annual reviews. That's a formal process. A formal process. It's changing the way we do business, and ultimately to succeed. To be honest, the early movers and the early adopters have already done it. So those of you that feel like you're waiting for it to stabilize before you make a change or figure out which way to go, I can tell you with confidence that we're really in that stage of, most organizations have already or are making switches internally on how they report, what they do, how they hire, team structures, engagement focus as opposed to, some of those type things. Very vital to the success of the teams. Okay. I'm going to talk here just a little bit about the next webinar series we're getting ready to run into, going into the autumn season. But if you do have questions, you do have comments, feel free to punch those in. But before we go too much further, I've got 2 different polls. As always, we use your information to go through and share with the rest of the ICBA and other organizations community. I got a quick poll because I want to find out how many groups have a portal, have something that's scalable, something that they use internally to be able to share information and can ultimately last you into the future. So we'll take some of this data and we'll build this into the future discussions as part of this. As you got to see some of the statistics earlier, and it looks like a lot of you have yeses, which is excellent to hear. We love seeing that your groups have something, and that's encouraging, especially with our banks. And as we prepare for a couple hundred other attendees in the other webinar series, we'll make sure to report these back as well here. Okay. So I'm going to close this this one here, and we're going to talk about the next webinar series. So coming out of the Millennial series, who they are, what they are, and we've talked about that in detail. The next series is going to be pretty key, especially as an organization. We're going to be talking about empowering digital natives with scalable infrastructure. Okay, so now that we've set the groundwork of who Millennials are, their traits, pros, cons, leadership styles, we're going to take a look at the main three focuses, which is community engagement, back office and helping our staff, as well as frontline efficiencies. And we're going to talk about how we can use tools that digital natives use second nature. What are they doing? What are we doing? What are some of the most successful groups and organizations and banks doing today to help set the stage? So I'm doing a number of interviews and meeting with some of the banks that have shared in our online community. Some of those type components, just to make sure that we're getting you everything you need from that side as well. Okay. Why Millennials? Yes, I'll go back. Yes, I'll go right here. Yep. So you guys can look at some of the references. Here you go. There you go, Steve. Let me know when you have that information. And also, we can also send slides too. I don't know if I have a slide with my contact information, but feel free to connect with us at passageways.com. Also be speaking at a number of conferences going into this fall regarding, millennials and efficiencies and what we're doing, what we're seeing. Again, we've got several hundred clients. Being able to apply some of these best practices, we're really excited for that. Okay. Okay, while we're at it, look like a good chunk of you have something in place. Those of you that didn't, or you just simply like to learn more about how to do it, I appreciate if you could do so. We all attend webinars and we all, do our research and want to learn more. I find a lot of groups will, some want to learn more about how to be more efficient, what to do. We've had others who say, you know what, I'm just researching, I'm not ready to talk about something like this yet. So I'd encourage you, if you could, fill in this poll. It helps us to identify, who would want some help and look at today. Otherwise, we can send you the recording. Feel free to share these with other staff, and there's going to be a survey to it as well. So with GoToMeeting and WebEx here, we don't have the ability to include fill in the blank. So if you could do me a favor, and when you receive the post-webinar survey, we look for all feedback. We read it all in there. If you could fill in, there's two components. One, what is the biggest challenge you face when promoting Millennials? That's one of the questions we have in there. If you could fill in just some of those components, it's going to help us as we lead into the next session. And then also just talking about the scalability of solutions. So I'd really encourage you to fill out the webinar, because we take it firsthand and go through and make changes from there. Okay. Excellent. Looks like we got that. Glad you got everything you needed there, Steve. Okay. I don't see any other questions or hands up in the poll. So with that, I'll be respectful of your time. I set the expectation at 30 minutes. We're right there. So I want to thank all of you for your time, your attentiveness, and if you'd like to learn more about the previous 1, 2, or 3 sessions of the Millennial series, we'll have that in the post-webinar email. Feel free to take a look at those. If you have any questions, again, stop by passageways.com. And we can talk more about some of the other components. But thank you for your time today and your attentiveness, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.